The world did not stop in 1962. But on that day, October 27th, humanity held a lit match, seconds away from touching the largest pile of dynamite we had ever built. We assume the Cold War's red line was drawn in meeting rooms in Washington and Moscow, between presidents and premiers. But what almost killed us was not the missiles in Cuba, but a catastrophic miscalculation deep underwater, 300 feet below the surface. The real threat from that day lies in the shocking fragility of human control. It was Black Saturday. American planes were airborne, Soviet targets were locked. It was 1 second before ignition. Inside a cramped Soviet submarine, suffocated by heat and contradictory orders, was Vasili Arkhipov. He was not the captain, but Soviet military law required his agreement to release the most dangerous tactical weapon on the planet. The commander, under attack from the American fleet and lacking communication with Moscow, gave the nuclear launch order. The fate of 500 million lives depended on the pen of a single man who had the right to say no. Why did he hesitate? What transpired inside that submerged bunker that allowed one voice to prevail? What if this hero had never existed? Find out why the 1962 missile crisis still haunts us today. The answer is buried deep beneath the Atlantic, aboard a single Soviet submarine, on a date history calls Black Saturday. The day is October 27, 1962. The world does not know it, but it is seconds from oblivion. On land, Kennedy and Khrushchev exchange cold, deadly ultimatums. But beneath the surface, the B-59 crew is suffocating, cooked by failed air conditioning, relentlessly hunted by American destroyers. Communication with Moscow is severed. They are blind, deaf, and utterly isolated, convinced that global nuclear war has already begun. The pressure mounts, internal temperature soaring past 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The captain, enraged and terrified, receives the clear signal of an attack and issues the definitive order: arm and fire the nuclear torpedo. But Soviet protocol demanded unanimous consent from 3 senior officers. 2 agree, prepared to vaporize the American fleet and trigger Armageddon. The fate of human civilization, the continuation of our species, rests on the conscience of a single man, Vasili Arkhipov. He hesitates. He refuses. He single-handedly shatters the chain of command. In that suffocating steel cabin, the world did not end because of one dissenting vote. But what does that mean for us today? It means peace was never guaranteed by treaties, but by fragile human decisions made under impossible pressure. It means the triggers that nearly wiped us out in '62, the communication failures, the irrational fear, the nuclear paranoia, they were never fully deactivated. They merely went dormant, awaiting the next mistake. And that is why 1962 is not history. It is a warning. That strained waiting for the next mistake did not begin in October. It was forged slowly in the scorching crucible of the Cold War, an era defined by paranoia and the power of mutual extinction. The planet was split between 2 superpowers, each holding a trigger aimed squarely at the other's heart. Ideology was merely the disguise. The true engine was fear, distilled into the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. MAD. It was a glacial, terrifying paradox. Peace was maintained only because war meant the end of everything. For 2 decades, the world had learned to live under this balance of terror, perpetually hovering over the abyss, convinced that the sheer scale of the weaponry guaranteed sanity. In the West sat John F. Kennedy, young, charismatic, yet bearing the crushing weight of leadership, constantly trying to project calm while managing internal pressure and Soviet aggression. He inherited the bomb and the unbearable burden of knowing he might be the first man who would condemn millions. His youthful vigor stood in stark contrast to the apocalyptic nature of his power. In the Kremlin, across the shattered Iron Curtain, sat Nikita Khrushchev, an older, impetuous veteran of revolution, equally bound by hardline rhetoric and the desperate need to project global strength after years of perceived American nuclear superiority. For Khrushchev, placing medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, was the perfect strategic chess move. A rapid way to offset America's missile presence in Turkey and to defend Fidel Castro, his key Caribbean ally. It was a test of will, a gamble played with the highest possible stakes. Cuba became the immediate focal point of this tension. It wasn't simply about ideology anymore, it was about geometry and reach. These Soviet missiles, carrying warheads capable of striking Washington, D.C. in mere minutes, eliminated the margin of error and shattered the precarious balance of terror. But while Kennedy and Khrushchev prepared for the public standoff, the true catastrophic threat lurked unseen beneath the waves. The horrifying reality of the Cold War lay in the delegation of death. The Soviet military doctrine allowed subordinate commanders, especially those deep beneath the ocean, to utilize tactical nuclear weapons if they believed they were under direct attack and cut off from Moscow. Nobody in the White House, perhaps not even the Kremlin, fully accounted for the human factor in this theater of war. The isolated men, far from radio contact and diplomatic protocols, trapped inside metal hulls. The power of ultimate destruction had been passed down to ordinary naval officers, men like Vasili Arkhipov, whose fingers rested on switches that could irreversibly rewrite the course of human history long before the politicians in the capitals finished their speeches. Then, on October 16, 1962, the calm routine of Washington was utterly shattered. Aerial reconnaissance images arrived at the White House, revealing the impossible: Soviet missile bases under hurried construction across Cuba. The moment the intelligence analysts confirmed the truth, a clock started ticking that might count down to the last second humanity would ever share. The world was about to discover that nuclear hell could fit into just 13 autumn days, and that global peace rested precariously on the desperate decisions made under crushing silence, both in the Oval Office and thousands of feet below the surface of the Atlantic. But the Black Saturday of October 27, 1962, was not defined merely by silence. It was defined by the sudden, terrifying shattering of that silence, when the war machine, once set in motion, began to spin dangerously out of control. The day ignited with a tragic and irreversible error. High above the Cuban sky, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr. piloted his U-2 surveillance craft, a tool of espionage that became, in that fatal instant, a lit fuse. Soviet protocol, handed down to nervous Cuban commanders, permitted the engagement of intrusive aircraft. A click, an SA-2 missile launch, and the U-2 disintegrated. The Cold War had claimed its first confirmed victim, transforming the diplomatic standoff into a direct, bloody confrontation. In Washington, the shock was visceral. Kennedy, who had worked tirelessly to avoid bloodshed, watched his delicate negotiation strategy crumble. The promise of de-escalation evaporated with the smoke trail of the missile. If the USSR was willing to shoot down an American pilot, what was the next move? The hawks in the Pentagon screamed for a full-scale invasion, asserting it was the only logical response to open aggression. The clock was no longer ticking toward a deadline. It had stopped, replaced by the deafening sound of an imminent global catastrophe. Khrushchev, thousands of miles away, was blinded by the fog of war. He had not personally ordered the shoot-down, yet he now faced the inevitable American response. The leaders, once masters of the chessboard, were suddenly rendered spectators, hostages to their own aggressive doctrines and the operational mistakes unfolding in the field. This loss of centralized control is the core threat that still lingers today. But the true point of inflection, the abyss into which humanity nearly tumbled, was not on the surface, nor in the presidential cabinets. It resided in the dark, crushing, claustrophobic depths of the Atlantic, aboard 4 Soviet attack submarines, one of which was the B-59. The crew lived a nightmare of isolation. For weeks, they had been submerged in a hostile environment, their mission shrouded in secrecy. The air conditioning failed. Internal temperatures soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels climbed dangerously, poisoning their minds and stripping them of rational thought. They were utterly cut off from Moscow, unable to receive external intelligence, relentlessly pursued by a destructive and aggressive U.S. Navy fleet determined to force them to surface. In that suffocating steel tube, the dividing line between paranoia and reality dissolved. The U.S. Navy, executing blockade procedures, commenced dropping signaling depth charges, small explosions designed merely to harass the submarine and force a formal, acknowledged surfacing. But to Captain Valentin Savitsky, exhausted and nearing delirium from the heat and pressure, there was nothing signaling about it. The terrifying percussion against the hull, amplified 1,000 times by the water pressure, sounded like the definitive commencement of war. He was convinced World War III had begun, and that the only remaining duty was to strike back before they were destroyed. The B-59 carried a T-5 torpedo, a weapon with a nuclear yield roughly equivalent to the Hiroshima bomb, potent enough to vaporize an entire aircraft carrier and unleash hell upon the US fleet. Savitsky slammed his fist down. "We're going to blast them," he screamed, his voice strained by heat and panic. "We will die, but we will sink them all. The world is at war. We must strike back." Soviet protocol, a safeguard against rogue commanders, demanded the concurrence of 3 senior officers for the launch: the captain, Savitsky, the political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, and the chief of staff of the flotilla, a man named Vasili Arkhipov, who happened to be aboard the B-59 that fateful day. Maslenikov, consumed by the same panic and conviction of impending doom as his captain, quickly agreed. The nuclear torpedo was being urgently readied for launch. The fate of hundreds of millions of lives, the entire future of civilization, hung precariously on the third and final voice. Arkhipov, unlike his comrades, maintained a remarkable, almost supernatural composure. A man possessing the cold, pragmatic experience of one who had already survived catastrophic naval disasters, he saw Savitsky's desperation, but not the definitive official proof of global war required to trigger annihilation. He knew that launching that T-5 torpedo would not be an act of retaliation, but the first deliberate, undeniable step in total mutual destruction. Against the desperate consensus of the bridge, Arkhipov stood steadfast, engaging in a furious, sweaty, desperate argument that lasted for agonizing minutes. His refusal was not mere insubordination. It was the single most consequential veto in human history. Vasili Arkhipov, standing alone against the weight of Soviet military procedure and the fear of his superiors, forced Savitsky to surface and communicate, rather than explode and initiate the end of the world. Black Saturday taught us that destruction can be triggered not by the deliberate acts of grand tyrants or wicked centralized schemes, but by ordinary men under unbearable localized stress, by communication failures, and by flawed protocols that allow paranoia to trump reason. Peace was secured not by the brilliant negotiation of Kennedy or the calculated retreat of Khrushchev, but by one man's sanity in a steel tomb hundreds of feet below the waves, a man whose pivotal actions remained classified for decades. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 still threatens us today because Arkhipov lesson is this: global stability does not rely on impenetrable treaties or advanced deterrence, but always terrifyingly upon the isolated morality and instantaneous sanity of a single individual buried under tons of pressure, merely one button push away from doomsday. In the next act, we will finally witness the aftermath of this near miss, exploring the frantic final negotiations that pulled humanity back from the brink, and how even after the immediate danger passed, the deep shadow of nuclear annihilation remained. If the profound shadow of nuclear annihilation remained, then the true victory was not merely the withdrawal of missiles, but the forced visceral acknowledgement that humanity had tripped upon the frayed, trembling edge of an abyss it had dug for itself. The world exhaled, a ragged, shared breath of relief that masked the deeper, chilling realization. We had survived the greatest crisis in history not through strategic genius or superior military might, but by sheer, agonizing luck. While diplomatic channels were celebrated in the sunlight, the darkest truth was buried deep in the silent, cold waters of the Atlantic. The world did not know the name of the man who truly saved the planet that day, the man who served as the fragile, solitary hinge upon which the future of civilization swung. His name was Vasili Arkhipov. Arkhipov, a Soviet submarine officer aboard the B-59, was plunged into a pressure cooker scenario. Under persistent attack by American destroyers, the crew, convinced war had already begun, prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo, an action that would have guaranteed immediate full-scale retaliation from the United States. According to protocol, all 3 senior officers had to agree. 2 men, including the captain, were ready to fire. It was Arkhipov, the fleet commodore, who, through sheer determination and a refusal to yield to panic or protocol, denied the final order. He stood as the ultimate, indispensable human firewall against machine-like destruction. It was not the cool calculation of political giants in Washington or Moscow that spared us, but the moral doubt, the courageous hesitation, the sanity of a single individual thousands of miles away from the decision-making centers of power. After Cuba, the world recognized that peace was suspended by a human hair, not by impenetrable military steel cables. The leaders learned that the slightest miscommunication or technical failure could initiate the final countdown. This led to the creation of the hotline, a direct communication link, an admission that systems and human beings under pressure inevitably fail. The lesson seemed clear. To survive, we must prioritize communication over confrontation. The subsequent treaties, like the limited test ban, were attempts to box the nuclear genie back into its bottle, sealing the knowledge of the human element's terrifying power. Yet, as decades passed, that vivid, terrifying lesson faded. This is precisely why the Cuban Missile Crisis still threatens us today. The danger is not just the existence of the bomb, but the persistence of the infrastructure of error. Warning systems designed for speed, not nuance. Tactical nuclear weapons deployed regionally, increasing the chances of decentralized rogue action, and political polarization that echoes the Cold War's zero-sum game mentality. Cuba proved that error is not merely a possibility in the nuclear age, it is a statistical certainty. There will be another close call, another moment where the fate of the world rests on a split-second decision made by a person under impossible stress. We look back at October 27, 1962 as a crisis averted, but its true legacy is a lingering unanswered question. When the next Black Saturday arrives, will the system find another Vasili Arkhipov? The tragedy of Cuba is that it granted us the horrifying knowledge of our absolute vulnerability, yet failed to instill the collective wisdom required to dismantle the mechanism of our own assured destruction. The clock of annihilation, controlled by human fallibility, still ticks, reminding us that we are just one unthinking yes away from reliving the day that could have ended everything. Humanity retreated from the precipice, but the true chilling lesson of Cuba lies not in the settlement reached, but in the abyss that still yawns beneath our feet. It was not perfect strategy, nor the genius of statesmen that saved us. Our survival hinged entirely on the hesitation of one man, Vasili Arkhipov, an officer who, in the unbearable heat of atomic pressure, dared to say no. Our ultimate deliverance depended on an act of moral insubordination, a single solitary point of sanity within a spiral of madness designed by the world's most powerful systems. Decades later, the missiles were removed from Cuba, but the underlying mindset, the reliance on mutually assured destruction, and the fragility of communication remains. The global security architecture that failed so catastrophically on that Black Saturday was never fully dismantled. Nuclear triggers still exist, operated by fallible humans under imperfect systems, subject to the same rushed judgment and deep distrust that almost cost us everything. This is why the 1962 crisis is not merely history, it is a pulsing, immediate reminder. It is why the threat still haunts us. Because while Arkhipov saved the world that afternoon by luck, there is no guarantee that in the next crisis, there will be another man ready to sacrifice protocol and career for the sake of humanity. The world did not stop in 1962, but it was fundamentally redefined by a single no. And the next gamble for survival has already begun.